Dark Side of the 90's is a documentary television series created by Insight Productions and RailSplitter Pictures for Vice Studios that takes a look at the popular culture of the 1990s. It is the spin-off of Vice's Dark Side of the Ring series. The first episode of Dark Side of the 90's aired on July 15, 2021. The series is narrated by Mark McGrath, vocalist of Sugar Ray, a rock band that attained mainstream popularity in the mid to late 1990s. After moderate success and generally favourable reviews, the show was renewed for a second season in September of 2021. Season 2 deals with various subjects from the 1990s. In episode 1, named Arsenio Hall, deals with the success of the Arsenio Hall show to younger audiences before its downfall due to competition from Jay Leno and David Letterman, alongside a controversial episode featuring the Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan. Episode 2 deals with MTV's 1992 debut of the reality TV sensation The Real World and its impact on the channel. In episode 3, the show deals with the documentary TV show Cops, featuring racial conflicts between white police officers against working class African Americans. Episodes 4 and 5 deal in two parts. The first episode deals with UFC Part 1, No Holds Barred, and it deals with the Bloody No Rules origin of the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Episode 5, titled UFC Part 2 To Live or Die in the Octagon, deals with the UFC survives multiple attempts to ban it and becomes a mainstream sport. Episode 6 deals with the tabloid journalism of television, namely Hard Copy and A Current Affair, and the salacious stories that uncovered them, among them the Amy Fisher saga. Episode 7 deals with the success of African-American sitcoms, namely Living Single, Martin and the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and the Emmy Award-winning variety show In Living Color, before falling into the pitfalls of fame. Episode 8 deals with Rush Limbaugh, who is a conservative talk radio's first megastar, claiming to have talent on loan from God, as he created a divide in America that is still unfolding 30 years on, and was definitely an influence on one Donald Trump. Episode 9 deals with the Y2K paranoia. At the end of the decade, the fear of the apocalypse looms, even for far-right militias, as two men become the stars of the real-life action thriller known as the Y2K scare. And episode 10 deals with the morning show wars. Morning TV is a profit center of the news divisions that produce them, with the Today Show and Good Morning America battling for dominance, where there was no room for failure. Now, I really enjoyed season 1, albeit that I found there was some shortcomings in terms of the way the documentary was presented, but season 2 really does pick up very well. I found each episode much more engaging and interesting. Look, it still deals from an American perspective of the 90s, but then the show is made in America, so I completely understand that. But I just found the subject matter just far more interesting. For example, the 2 episodes based on the UFC, today a multi-billion-dollar sporting event, but back then it was just so basic and almost barbaric in some ways, but still fascinating to see how a car salesman fundamentally founded this idea of pitting different fighting styles against each other. Also to see the rise of Ken Shamrock or Frank Shamrock, and to see their hard upbringings and what made them into the ultimate. I was glad that they spaced this story over 2 episodes, as it really went in depth of just how fascinating it was, the foundation of UFC, and how difficult it was to get going, when the likes of, for example, Senator John McCain, who of course himself was a proponent of boxing, was so vehemently against the UFC. It's amazing to see where the sport has ended up today, as now it's a multi-billion-dollar glamorous industry run by the ever-present Dana White. But back then, it was just so simple and plain. I also liked the way this season now took subjects that were primarily happening in the 90s and tied them into what's happening in the world today. For example, the show Cops, which in many ways was a propaganda show to show how wonderful the police were. Of course, it helped that the police had to see the final edit of the show and would basically approve what was seen by the public and what wasn't. Of course, the show glamorizes policing and makes these guys out to be heroes. Now, of course, there are a lot of good policemen, but of course, there are a lot of bad policemen. Hence, the reason that we've seen so many of these massive protests, for example, Black Lives Matter, within the last few years, because of the brutal policing, particularly in the United States. And this episode really delves into the behind the scenes of the show Cops, and of course, the racial conflicts stemming already from the Rodney King beating back in 1991, which of course led to the LA riots, all the way to present day, where some of these issues are still ever present. Even the episode on conservative talk show radio host Rush Limbaugh, who of course was known for inciting the divide, inciting rage, attacking the liberal media, attacking what he viewed was liberal agendas, and basically playing up to an audience that was ready to feed off his very words. This, of course, all leads to the same rhetoric that we see Donald Trump using in his own presidential campaign, and a lot of the Republican Party sort of turning towards as they push and create the divide within the United States. Even the episode of the Y2K paranoia was just fascinating to relive that again, as I remember it so well, this absolute fear and paranoia surrounding the potential ending of the world, as it were, when the clock struck midnight. And of course, looking back on it in hindsight, it just all seems so silly. The episodes on TV tabloid journalism and the rise, of course, of the morning show battles was also fascinating to see, just the general media attention and how the shift in focus in the 90s, from the more conservative presentation of news stories to now the more salacious stories, and focusing more on the drama of a story rather than its factual base. I really enjoyed the episode on the rise of African American sitcoms. It was just fascinating to see, for example, the broadcasting network Fox taking television to a new place and giving these performers a platform in which to show their fantastic talents. Also sad to see how they all just sort of suddenly came to an end. And I include in that the Arsenio Hall show, which was obviously an African-American comedian hosting his own show for the first time on late-night television, and he just approached it from a completely different angle, giving new light, for example, to the rise of hip-hop, and how new comedians and new actors got a chance to express themselves and show you who they really were. Arsenio definitely had a way of connecting with his audience and his guests. Unfortunately, though, the show was sort of trounced by the rise of the likes of Jay Leno and, of course, David Letterman. And Arsenio probably took it one step too far by having the controversial leader of the Nation of Islam, Louis Farrakhan, on his show. One of the most interesting episodes within the series I found was the one based on the Real World television series. Now, I am not a proponent of reality television. I can't say I really enjoy it. At the end of the day, it's not really reality, is it? But back then, reality television was still finding its feet, as it were, and I felt that these shows were a lot more upfront about real-world issues and dealing with real people. And of course, I found the discussion about the Real World Season 3, which was set in San Francisco, and of course, the noteworthy depiction of Pedro Zamora's struggle with AIDS, as he literally lived with the disease on the show, and was also notable for featuring the first ever same-sex commitment ceremony on TV between Zamora and his partner, Sean Sasser. It just was a very touching story of a very real man living with a real disease, and of course, Pedro, would lose his life shortly after the show had finished airing. Dark Side of the 90s really covers this episode with a lot of sensitivity and really taps into the real-life emotion that viewers probably would have been feeling whilst watching that series. Like I say, for me, Season 2 is a massive step up. I found myself engrossed in every episode, and each one passed by in the blink of an eye, as I just found it so fascinating and interesting to watch. The guests they got on as well were so much more relevant and the right people to talk to in context of the show. I also found the topics that this season covers just much more interesting and much more in depth and more relevant to what really was the 90s culture. Now, there are plenty more stories to cover, and of course some of the bigger stories, for example, Bill Clinton, O.J. Simpson, etc. But in the same breath, I quite like the way the Dark Side of the 90s has gone for lesser known subjects and avoided the sort of big stories that we all know about so well and have been covered so in depth. It's been a very good season, and I really do look forward to seeing what Dark Side of the 90s brings in Season 3. Dark Side of the 90s, Season 2 gets a 9 out of 10.